Senator Rubio.
Thank you. I have here the President's order regarding Cuba from January 14th. It reads that in an effort to continue efforts to reach out to the Cuban people in support of their desire to freely determine their country's future, which is the stated goal of policy towards Cuba. And it says part of the things it expands on is purposeful travel for the purpose of enhancing contact with the Cuban people and supporting civil society through purposeful travel. Are you familiar, Mr. Secretary, with a case of a U.S. citizen that traveled to Cuba to distribute communications technology on the island, particularly, I believe, to the Jewish community?
Yes, I am, Mr. Rubio.
Would distributing technology to members of that community or the Cuban people fall within the context of meaningful, purposeful travel? I mean, would it fall within the guise of what we're talking about here, to enhance contact with the Cuban people?
With respect to Mr. Gross, Mr. Gross was in Cuba as a long-term development worker. He was working with elements of the Jewish community
to be in contact with the Cuban
to take contact with the Cuban people, and
well, he's facing 20 years in prison.
Yes.
Is that correct?
He might face 20 years in prison. That's correct.
So are we going to issue an advisory to Americans that are looking at doing purposeful travel to make contact with people in Cuba that they may also face 20 years if their contact is too purposeful?
Anybody who travels to Cuba, I imagine that including relatives of Cubans, and the numbers increased this year. There are about 300,000 Cuban Americans who travel to Cuba. May take some risks in traveling, but it is our view that it's very important for us to be able to have the capacity to have both not only Cuban Americans but also citizens across our country
to purposeful travel. Right, but is the State Department prepared to begin advising both Cuban Americans and non-Cuban Americans traveling to Cuba, what you've just said, that there are risks to traveling in Cuba?
I think that, I don't know whether there's some specific guidance on that, but I think that there is an awareness that there is a risk, and that we had, the institutions that send. I was a professor at Georgetown, and when our students would go down on a license to Cuba, we always were mindful of the fact that they needed to be particularly careful.
But specifically, based on your testimony and what we've read about this particular case and others, isn't it wise, or would it be unwise, to advise people looking to travel to Cuba, be careful how much contact you make, because if you upset the Cuban government, you may be jailed and face 20 years. And by the way, we may not be able to do much at all. In fact, what have we done with the case of this U.S. citizen?
I think, at least from the experience that I've seen, I mean, we have one case right now. I can't think of any other case recently of somebody who's been, of an American citizen who's been arrested for this kind of activity. And there are all kinds of people who've been going down to Cuba for a long period of time on the people-to-people program. And I can think of people from friends of mine from Tampa, for example, who go down with their church to Cuba all the time.
But the church visits are largely run through the Ecumenical Council, correct?
Well, look, let me clarify that these again, the travel is going to be purposeful, regulated travel, where individuals and organizations, institutions will have to get licenses in order to go. So it's under the framework of the same sorts of arrangements that we have now, Senator.
And now, in terms of, because I think there's clearly a cost-benefit analysis that I hope the Department made when making this decision in the administration between, on the one hand, the benefits of people-to-people contact if you don't go to jail, and the other of the revenues that it provides the Cuban government, which is a repressive regime. In fact, in January alone, we know of 260 political arrests. In fact, yesterday, Sarah Fonseca was brutally beaten in the streets of Havana. So it continues to be a repressive regime, and it has to pay for its repressiveness. And one of the ways it does that, perhaps the single largest source of funding to the Cuban regime, is remittances and travel by Cuban Americans to the island. For example, many people may not know this. You're a Cuban American, or if you used to live, you got to get a Cuban passport. The funds all flow to the Cuban government, and then you got to go out and get a ticket through a charter company, which is basically, if this is an accurate assessment, basically a business partner of the Castro government, where a significant percentage of the money you pay for your travel to Cuba flows to the Cuban government. Correct?
Yeah, our policy, Senator, is to have rules and regulations that will maximize
Right.
the contact between the American people.
No, I understand,
and
but I'm looking at the
Cuban people.
revenue side. What I'm trying to get at is you have to get a Cuban passport, which is money directly to the Cuban government, source of revenue. Then you got to get a ticket to a charter company, which is the business partner of the Castro government, revenue to the Cuban government. Then when you land, you get hit with an entry fee, which is direct revenue to the Cuban government. Then they make you change your currency, which they take 20% of, revenue to the Cuban government. Estimates are that about $4 billion a year flow directly to the Cuban government from remittances and travel by Cuban Americans, which is the largest, perhaps the single largest source of revenue to the most repressive government in the region.
Yeah, the remittances to Cuba are a large number too. But let me just simply say this: that there may be some ancillary benefits to the Cuban government, but it is our view that to be able to have direct contact with the Cuban people, that Americans have direct contact with the Cuban people, will provide them with a kind of space that will allow them to become much more independent of the regime.
Right.
If we continue to isolate the Cuban people, we simply play into the hands of the Cuban regime.
Well,
and I think that we need to, in that sense,
But that
expand
goes
these
back to the
efforts.
case of this American citizen whose attempt was to create a technology or help people create a technology platform where there could be communication with the outside world. I guess my last question, and it kind of is redundant, I asked this earlier, but this is important because a lot of people from my state are expressing an interest in traveling to Cuba, including people that are not Cuban Americans. Is the Department of State prepared to assure American citizens that if they go to Cuba, they'll be able to talk to whoever they want, do whatever they want within the civil law? I mean, obviously you can't violate civil law, but they'll be able to talk to anybody they want, including someone like Sarah Fonseca. They'll be able to go there and actually tell people about the outside world, talk to dissidents, and that they will not get in trouble. We're prepared to assure people that if they travel to Cuba, nothing bad will happen to them.
Senator, I can't give you that assurance, but I'll also point to the fact that there's been a lot of experience with travel to Cuba, including that of many, many Cuban Americans, and we still continue to think that that has a beneficial effect in promoting greater freedom in Cuba.
Thank you.